With our program. So welcome everybody to another edition of LSC in the House Planetarium Online. I'm Mike, the Planetarium Director at Liberty Science Center, which contains the largest planetarium in the Western Hemisphere, the Jennifer Chalsty Planetarium, about 89 feet in diameter. Normally holds 400. We're currently maxing out at 90 to ensure proper distancing. So joining me in the chat today is Krista, one of our planetarium staff. She'll be there answering questions that you have about astronomy throughout the program. And at the end of our 35-minute program, we'll also leave some time to address the questions that have come in the chat. Now, Liberty Science Center, again, is open. We have been open ever since Labor Day of this last year. If you do want to come to see us, we're open Thursdays through Sundays normally. Special deal, this week we're also open on Monday with the schools being out in spring break. And we do planetarium shows every hour. The same folks you see doing these shows online are the ones who are in the dome giving the presentations. So Krista, Andrew, and I are the show givers as well. And we do recommend getting tickets in advance because we have been selling out our shows on weekends especially. We're also celebrating animals with our Wild About Animals festival going on from now through early May. And as part of that, Krista, who's our laser producer as well, has created a new laser show featuring beloved songs about animals, everything from Baby Shark to Who Let the Dogs Out to The Lion Sleeps Tonight. And so that's the last show of the day on each of the days that we're open. So maybe you can come and join us for that as well. So our program here is presented free of charge to the public. There is no cost whatsoever for the show. If you see anyone saying that in the chat, that is, just ignore that. If you want to donate, we are doing this as a free public service. There is a little LSC logo donate button. That's the one true way that you can donate and support Liberty Science Center for this program. So having said that, let's go ahead and go to where astronomy has its origins as we began to explore ways in which certain holidays are marked by the sun, the moon, or the stars. So we're going to head on out to look at the nighttime sky. We're going to go back to Friday, the 19th of March, so a couple of weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, yesterday to be exact. And we are here looking at the sky as you'd see it just about an hour before the sun goes down. So it's also a time to say farewell to the great constellations of the winter, as happens every year. So the sun here around the first day of spring comes up at 7 and goes down at 7. It's the Vernal Equinox. And as we go into the evening sky, it'll get dark by about 8. We're going to go a little bit later. We're going to go to around 10 o'clock this evening. And then looking towards the western sky, and this is a sight you can see sort of anywhere in the northern hemisphere, we have our last hurrah for the great constellations of the winter here in April and early May. So over in the west, we can see the constellation that's the single easiest constellation to see in the sky, Orion the Hunter. Orion pops right out. Primarily a wintertime constellation, although it holds on till the end of April. Orion duking it out with Taurus the Bull, that V shape in front of him. Taurus and Orion joined by the brightest star in the sky, the dog star Sirius. So this will be the star that really you notice when it's getting dark. It's so brilliant that long ago the Greeks called it scorching, which is where the word Sirius comes from. When I lived in Hawaii, the Hawaiian term for this star is A'a, which is also the Hawaiian word for fire. So it really stands out at minus 1.4 magnitude, by far the brightest star. And especially as it's getting low in the sky, as it is here in April, it seems to scintillate different colors as it seems through the thick atmosphere of our planet. Called the dog star, it is the brightest star, in fact, the only bright star in the constellation of Canis Major, the big dog. So these three are three of the 6 classic constellations of the winter. And of the 6, they're the first three that are going to plunge into the sun. So we're going to lose these by the end of April. So you just have one more month to catch these classic wintertime constellations. The other three classics above them are going to hang on for one more month, but they'll be gone by the 1st of June. And if you have a big dog, Canis Major, you do have to have a little dog, Canis Minor. The stick figure for Canis Minor, by the way, literally is a stick. Procyon, the bright star, and Canis Minor, the little dog, the other dog of Orion. So above that, we have the Gemini with the bright stars Castor and Pollux. So Procyon is the bright star in the little dog. And the star of the Gemini that's nearest to it also begins with a P, Pollux. So that's the way you can remember which of the two is which. Pollux is the one nearest to Procyon. Castor is the one nearest to the bright star Capella in Auriga. So the Gemini helped Jason find the Golden Fleece, high overhead. And then finally, in terms of the big six, over here we have Auriga, so obviously a man holding a baby goat as he drives a chariot. You'll probably need a helper on that. So these upper constellations will be gone by the time we get to June. So the stars come back at the same time every year and are in the same patterns that we've observed for hundreds of years. They're so far away they don't change their positions much in even a couple of thousand years. But planets, being hundreds of thousands of times nearer to us, do change their position against a starry background. So sometimes you have a lot of planets in the sky, and sometimes, as here in early April, we're down to just one visible planet, at least one you can see if you don't have a telescope. And that is the planet Mars. Mars getting a lot of attention, of course, with the Perseverance lander and the other two missions from the United Arab Emirates and from China that have arrived there as well. Now, if we turn around and face towards the southern sky, turning away from the stars of winter, the classic constellation of the spring is Leo the Lion, which is high overhead here. And this outline reminds me that a couple of colleagues I used to work with, including Ken Miller, who I worked with in a couple of different venues, have often referred to this constellation as a mouse. So here, if you imagine this being the face of the mouse, and then here is the crooked mouse tail, you can see it either as a mouse or you can see it as a lion, with this being the mane, the heart, and the back quarters of a lion. And that is the official name, the first of the 12 labors of Hercules, the great lion of Nemea, and the archetypal constellation of the spring. Now, as we go through the night, I wanted to show you that there are two more planets that have just come back into the morning sky as of about a week ago. So here, beginning in late March, going through April, you can catch both Jupiter and Saturn before the first light of day. The really bright one is Jupiter. Jupiter is brilliant in part because it's really big and its clouds are really shiny, brighter than Sirius, the brightest star in the sky. And the planet Saturn, not quite as bright, it's further away and not quite as big, but a beautiful sight even in a modest telescope. And now that these two planets are back after their 2-month sojourn behind the sun, we're going to have them with us all the rest of 2021. And by the summertime, they'll be rising at sunset and overhead the entire evening. So we'll have lots of opportunity to see these planets as we get to the later spring and the summer. So that's just a quick overview of some of the highlights of our current April sky. But now turning our attention to it being the first day of spring, we go ahead and face towards the east. So the first day of spring and the first day of fall are the 2 days of the year when the sun comes up exactly in the east. And right now it happens at 7 because we're on daylight saving time. Otherwise this would rise at 6 in the morning. And then it's overhead for exactly 12 hours, setting at 7 p.m. So this is the spring equinox. Equinox means equal night in Latin because you have exactly 12 hours of day and 12 hours of night here on the first day of spring and for that matter, the first day of the fall. So I see that, we're asking folks for their opinion. Is it a lion or a mouse? Maybe the expression about, are you a lion or a mouse, came from people just sitting around looking up and trying to make sense out of Leo the lion. So here we are, now sunset on the first day of spring, which occurred on the 20th of March this year. So sunset at 7 p.m., pardon the typo there, sunset at 7 p.m. So up at 7 a.m., sunset at 7 p.m. in the sky for 12 hours. So the only reason we have seasons is that unlike Venus, which is straight up, the Earth is tilted 23.5 degrees. And as it goes around the sun, as the year goes on, sometimes the northern part of our planet is tilted in towards the sun and gets more sunlight. And then it's summertime in the northern hemisphere. And other times the northern hemisphere is tilted away from the sun and gets less sunlight, causing winter. And in between, we have times where neither hemisphere is tilted in and neither hemisphere is tilted out. On these 2 days, the spring and the fall equinoxes, the tilt of our Earth doesn't matter at all because neither hemisphere is tilted in, neither hemisphere is tilted out. On those 2 days, day and night are equal pretty much all over the world. First day of spring and the first day of fall. And so this first day of spring especially, a really important day in many, many cultures. For example, the astrological year begins not on January 1, but on the first day of spring, time of renewal, things beginning again, and so forth. Now, as the Earth goes around the sun appears to slowly move in front of different signs of the zodiac as the year goes on. So here we are going through the year. Now, of course, this is where the idea of signs of the zodiac come from, but also, which used to confuse me, you of course can't see the zodiac sign that the sun is in because the sun is in front of it. So the month that's aligned with each zodiac sign is actually the exact constellation you can't see. But long ago, folks were smart enough that they figured out long ago, okay, we can't see the Archer, for example, at a certain time during the year because the sun is right in front of it and blocking it off. So, but as we go around the sun does seem to slowly move against the starry background. Now, it's not actually the sun moving, it's us going around it, but the illusion is that the sun is very slowly moving against the background of the stars. And when, in that annual motion, the sun is exactly on the celestial equator, that gives us the exact moment when spring begins. The celestial equator is exactly what it sounds like. We're just taking the equator of the Earth and projecting it into outer space. So if you've always wondered, like, what do they mean when they say that spring begins at a certain moment in time? That's what it means. In the annual motion of the sun, as it slowly goes against the stars, when it crosses that celestial equator, that is the exact moment when spring begins. So this year, the sun crossed the celestial equator at 5:37 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time on March 20, this last weekend. And the question about the exact moment for when spring begins becomes important as we try to think about how we, for example, mark off when Easter occurs. So another way to think about that, we're going to say goodbye to our beloved New Jersey and fly to a nation in the southern hemisphere whose name actually means equator in Spanish, Ecuador. But as we're pulling away, I would like to stop for a moment and look back towards home, sweet home. Well, I notice we're getting a couple of votes for Leo being a mouse. People are seeing more of a mouse than a lion there. Whatever works for you in the constellations. If you don't see a man carrying baby goats as he drives a chariot, find a pattern that helps you to remember what those stars look like. So as we're flying away from home sweet home, here is the Jennifer Chalsty Planetarium Here is the rest of Liberty Science Center. Here is our ample parking lot. Here is 78. Some of you may have seen our large dome as you've driven down that road. The Hudson Bergen Light Rail goes right here. We have a stop here as well. And as we're pulling further away, we can get more of a sense for where we are in the greater geography of the Northeast. So if you try to find Liberty Science Center again, here's Liberty State Park, our park. Here's where we are. Here is the Statue of Liberty. Here is Ellis Island with its Immigration Museum. And here is Lower Manhattan as well. So as you can see, we're really close to Manhattan and easily accessible by the path. So while visiting fantastic Manhattan, come over and see us sometime over at Liberty Science Center. All right, so we're heading to the equator and to a city in Ecuador that lies right on the equator called Quito. I always imagined that it was roasting hot in Quito. I've never been there, although I've been to other parts of South America, but apparently it's quite high up and can be quite chilly. So as we land in Quito here on March 20, the first day of spring, if you're looking up on the equator on the first day of spring, at the very tippity top of the sky, the zenith, on that day, the sun will go exactly overhead. It'll actually be in the zenith at local noon. So that's another way of explaining that the sun is on the celestial equator, and if you're on the equator on Earth and looking up, you'd see the sun exactly in the very top of the sky. So when I was a kid, I'd heard that the sun was overhead at noon. But that's never true unless you're in the tropics. That's the only part of the world that has overhead sun. And on the equator, the 2 days of overhead sun are the first day of spring and the first day of fall. So that's a little bit about how we mark the first moment of spring. Spring starts at the exact moment that the sun is exactly over the Earth's equator. And that is one of the markers, for example, for Easter is finding the first day of spring. But that's not the only story in terms of how you work out, how you mark off a holiday like Easter, for example. The moon gets involved as well. And whenever you throw the moon into the equation, it gets pretty interesting in terms of your calendar. So the moon, full on March 28. So last weekend, it was a full moon. And the moment of a full moon also has an exact moment, much as the first day of spring has an exact moment. And we need to understand that as well to understand how certain holidays are set by the moon. Because I've had that question also. Like, you say the moon is full at a certain time. What does that even mean? Well, here again, if we pull off of Earth and look at, in this case, the moon going around the Earth, we can help to get at that question. And at the greater question of the eternal human challenge of making the cycle of the moon match up to the cycle of our passage around the sun in 1 year. Because believe you me, it's not easy to line these two up. So here is the moon. Currently we're showing it as a new moon, the moon exactly in between the sun and the Earth. Now, half the moon is always lit, just as half of any moon or planet is always lit. What changes is how much of a lit side we see as the moon goes around us. It takes 29 and a half days for the moon to go around the Earth once. That's exactly how long it takes to go, for example, from a new moon to a new moon. So as we go around, as we watch the moon go around Earth, as we get beyond the new moon phase, you'll start to see just a little bit of the lit side of the moon appearing, creating that beautiful sight of an early crescent moon. And that early crescent moon is going to be very important when we talk both about how they set Ramadan and also how the Hawaiian festival of Makahiki is determined. That first visible sliver of a moon lit from the right as you look at it is very important. So this is the beginning of the cycle of the moon around the Earth. Again, this takes 29 and a half days for one complete orbit. And the moment of the moon being full, when the entire visible lit side of the moon can be seen from Earth, well, that's the exact moment when there's a straight line between the sun, the Earth in the middle, and the moon. At that point, you see the entire lit moon. And so it's when you have that straight line that marks the exact moment of when the moon is a full moon. And so the full moon that we just had happened at 2:48 Eastern Daylight Time. I believe it was last Sunday. But here's a challenge, like trying to coordinate the cycle of the moon and the cycle of us going around the sun is really difficult in the short run. It takes 29 and a half days for the moon to go around the Earth once. It takes 365 and a quarter days for us to go around the sun. So if you decide to have a year of 12 lunar months of 29 and a half days, that's only 354 days. You're 11 days short of a full year. So if you say, hey, well, let's have 13 lunar months in a year instead, well, that would give you 383 days, which is way too long for a year. So in the short run, the cycle of the moon and the cycle of the sun just don't match up. It doesn't work. It's a tight fit. But here's the thing. If you take a cycle of 19 years, 19 years is exactly 235 lunar months. So if you have a calendar based on a 19-year cycle, you can fit neatly 235 lunar months of 29 and a half days each into that, and your 2 years at that point can neatly line up. But it does wind up having to use this longer cycle of, in this case, 19 years exactly. It's called the Metonic cycle, and that it underpins a lot of calendars that we hear about. And comes up when we try to figure out how they officially mark Easter. So the standard definition of Easter is that you wait for the first day of spring, and then you wait for the next full moon, and then the next Sunday is Easter. And that's pretty close to being accurate. But perhaps not surprisingly, it is not 100% how things really go in this world of ours. Nothing ever is that simple, right? So a couple of clarifications. First of all, Easter is set not by the first moment of spring, but by March 21, whether or not the first day of spring happens to fall on that day or not. The First Council of Nicaea declared in 325 AD that spring will always start in terms of marking Easter on the 21st of March. So even if your spring begins on the 20th of March, as it did this year, the 21st of March is the marker for determining when Easter is going to happen. So you wait for the 21st of March. That helps you avoid like the debate about what time zone the moon is full or not full in by just saying it's going to always be March 21. And then you wait for the full moon. But the full moon used for Easter is determined by the ecclesiastical lunar calendar, which is a calendar set of tables based on the 19-year Metonic cycle. And generally, it works out very closely to where the real moon is in the real sky, but it's not an exact match. It actually is a mathematical table used to say this day is when the moon will be full. And then if you do those two things, you go to March 21, you check your ecclesiastical lunar table for when the moon is supposed to be full after the first day of spring, then that following Sunday is how you mark Easter. So historically, we've done some pretty intriguing things to try to coordinate the cycle of the moon and the cycle of our path around the sun. And in most cases, as with this year, if you just say it's a Sunday after the first full moon, after the first day of spring, that does wind up being pretty correct most of the times, but not exactly is there a lineup every year. Just checking to see if there's a few questions here before we head on to talk about other holidays. So basically, Easter here is set that way, but what if you had a holiday that was set purely by the cycle of the moon, by the 29 and a half day cycle of the moon around the earth? Because there are holidays that are set that way. And for example, the sacred month of Ramadan in Muslim tradition is set by waiting for the new moon and then looking for the first visible appearance, the actual physical appearance of the moon in the sky to help determine the beginning of that festival. And so here on April 13th, so a couple of weeks from now, that should be the day when it will be possible to see the slender crescent of the moon just past that new moon phase that we saw in our diagram a couple of moments ago. And so a good indication that your holiday or your month is set purely by a lunar cycle is that if a holiday can happen at any time during the year, then almost certainly it's the moon that's being used solely as a marker for that. So because the calendar here is based on a year of 12 lunar months, and because lunar months are in real life either 29 or 30 days, the festival or the sacred month of Ramadan happens generally about 11 days earlier every year. So here in 2021, it'll occur on the 13th of April. In the following year, 2022, it'll be on the 2nd of April, and will be then in March 2023. So that's a matter of actually marking it an important event by observing the visible appearance of a little crescent of a moon and setting your holiday that way. So, and taking the sun and coordinating to the solar calendar entirely out of the question. With a festival or event like Passover, commemorating the flight out of Egypt of the Hebrew people, that is an event that also coordinates a lunar calendar and a solar calendar. So Passover does need to happen in the spring. It's defined in the Bible, so it has to be synced up to when spring occurs, but is otherwise based upon the Hebrew lunar calendar. And the Hebrew lunar calendar is generally a calendar of 12 months. And the month of Nisan is the one in which Passover happens. But as we saw with Ramadan, if you only have a calendar of 12 lunar months, you're going to get out of sync pretty quickly with the solar calendar. And it is very clear from the Bible that Passover, which happens in the month of Nisan, has to occur in the springtime. So how do you coordinate these two calendars? Well, in the Hebrew calendar, the interesting way of fixing this is to insert not a leap day, but a leap month. So the calendar is based on the 19-year cycle, the Metonic cycle. But out of these 19 years of every cycle, on 7 of the 19 years, a 13th month is inserted into the year. And that insertion of an extra month lines up almost exactly with having a holiday like Passover occur when it needs to happen in the springtime. So Adar is the month that on 7 of the 19 years has an extra month inserted into it to get the lunar calendar in sync with the solar calendar so that Passover happens early in the springtime. And so just as one example here of a calendar noting when these extra months were inserted back in the early 20th century. So every 2 or 3 years on average, you would have another month inserted. When they insert the month of Adar as an extra leap month, that becomes Adar 1, and the regular month of Adar becomes Adar 2 in the course of that. So that's another way, by inserting an extra lunar month into the lunar calendar, of making your calendar sync up with the solar year so that you are observing Passover, in this case, on the first day or around the beginning or early spring. So 3 different ways of approaching how you mark the holidays by the stars or sacred events by the stars, each finding their different solution for coordinating what seems to be uncoordinatable, the solar cycle and the lunar cycle. All right, so a couple of other holidays I wanted to talk about. So we haven't really talked about holidays set by the stars. And since the name of this show is Holidays and the Stars, I should bring those into the equation as well. So, because mainly it's the solar and lunar cycles that are used for setting Passover, for example, and Ramadan and for Easter. But a couple of holidays that are actually set by the stars, maybe in one case, one that surprises you has a celestial origin, unless you watched our Astronomy of Halloween show last year. So here are the Pleiades, the seven sisters, a beautiful tiny cluster of stars that ride on the back of Taurus, the bull. And the Pleiades are used as a marker, were used as a marker in ancient Celtic lands to mark a very important day at the end of October. So in some cultures, it's more important to mark a time in the middle of the season. It's easy to mark the first day of fall. It's easy to mark the first day of winter by the sun. But what if the most important day for you was in between the first day of fall and the first day of winter? What if late October, so you were in Ireland, and the time to bring the cattle in from the high pastures 2,000 years ago was around October 31? Well, the sun is not very useful as a marker. And what if you wanted to make sure you mark that exact point in time every year, instead of using a lunar calendar where things can go back and forth by a month at least, even if it's coordinated to the solar calendar? Well, that's how stars can be really helpful in terms of marking specific days in the calendar. So the idea of late October being a time to bring the cattle in, an important day to mark, it evolved into the festival called Samhain, which is also both the New Year for the Celts and also their Day of the Dead. So we're going to take advantage of our flying capabilities in our Digistar system and fly from New Jersey to Ireland to talk a bit about Samhain, which evolved into our modern day festival of Halloween. So we're, for a second time, saying farewell temporarily to the beloved Northeast, heading for the Emerald Isle. As we approach the Emerald Isle, we'll see why it's emerald. There's a lot of clouds over Ireland. There was a time when I lived in Seattle, they were trying to nickname Seattle the Emerald City. And it's the Emerald City for the same reason Ireland is the Emerald Isle. Lots of rain. So we're heading, in this case, to County Meath, north of Dublin, to the Hill of Ward, which was used in Samhain or New Year's celebrations 2,000 years ago. So this October 31 date in Celtic lands was a time when all the souls who had died that year were collected and brought down to the underworld, and was also a time to resolve all past debts and get ready for the new year. It was also a time when there were spirits roaming the land, so both spirits of past ancestors for whom you may want to leave treats on the doorsteps, maybe spirits you wanted to hide from, you might want to disguise yourselves, maybe some things that evolved into Halloween began here in Celtic lands 2,000 years ago. At this Hill of Ward in County Meath, as the sun went down, the Pleiades, the marker for this event, rise at sunset and then are due overhead at midnight. And the ceremonies often involved having all the bonfires across the land being extinguished as the Pleiades rose in the sky and were due overhead at midnight. So sounds pretty eerie to me. Here we are, the Pleiades right overhead on this day when all of the souls of the deceased are roaming the lands, and at that day, that night, all the fires are extinguished. So at midnight, with the Pleiades high overhead, they would light a fire using firestone, and then they have torches bring those firelights to the hearths across of Ireland, the fireplaces. And so gradually, as the day began to dawn, the light would spread back across the land. So a lot of these traditions that were established in ancient Ireland were actually things that evolved into Halloween. I've often said the most famous Irish holiday in America is not St. Patrick's Day, it's Halloween, and a day specifically set by the Pleiades being overhead at midnight. Now, if you want to hear more about this, again, all of our past shows are available on our website. The Astronomy of Halloween even talks about how the Hell Gate of Ireland was the portal where all of these souls were taken down to the underworld. So I went and found a picture of the Hell Gate, and it's just like tiny little hole in the ground. So it's not as dramatic as we thought. But if you want to learn more about this, or many of the other topics we talked about, we have a lot of shows available on our LSC in the House website. So again, a holiday originally set by the Pleiades being overhead at midnight. And One that may surprise some folks actually has celestial origins. Now, the last holiday I'm going to talk about is one that also involves an island nation and also involves the Pleiades, although it also, in this case, we're going to throw in the moon also as a marker. So going to the Hawaiian Islands, which is where I was working before I moved to New Jersey, the Hawaiian New Year, or Makahiki, is also set, as in the case of Samhain in Ireland, by the rising of the Pleiades at sunset and being directly overhead at midnight. So the Hawaiian name for the Pleiades is the Makali'i, the little eyes. It can be a little confusing. Makahiki is the Hawaiian year, or the festival of the New Year. The Makali'i is a little tiny cluster of the Pleiades whose rising at sunset, being overhead at midnight, determines that festival in Hawaii. And so these stars are exactly overhead nowadays on the 17th of November every year. Again, stars come back at the same time every year. That's why they're a really good marker if you want to highlight one specific point in the year. And being further south in Ireland, when I say the Pleiades are overhead, they're almost exactly in the top of the sky from Hawaii. So currently they set the Hawaiian New Year, the Makahiki, by waiting for the Pleiades, the Makali'i, to be overhead at midnight, which happens on November 17 every year. And then, as in Ramadan, you wait for the appearance of a crescent moon just after the full moon. And that appearance of the crescent moon then marks the beginning of Makahiki season, the New Year season. And this year, that will happen on the 5th of December, weather permitting. Of course, weather is also a factor when you actually base a holiday on viewing the crescent moon. So that Makahiki period was a time of peace in the Hawaiian Islands and a time of celebration. So it is a time marked by these banners that you see here. These celebrations are still carried out to this day here in the Hawaiian Islands. Music and dance are very common during this season. And going back, Captain Cook and artists who were with him also made illustrations of festivals and games, Makahiki games that were very common. Here we have a boxing competition. So a time of peace and celebration and of games, marked again by waiting for the Pleiades to be overhead at midnight and then waiting for that first visible crescent moon after the new moon. So several really interesting different ways to figure out how to mark your holidays. Usually if you have a holiday that moves evenly through the year, it's probably marked by the moon only. And holidays that vary by about a month or so, whether it's Easter or Makahiki, generally have some way of combining the solar year with the path of the sun around, of the moon around our planet Earth. So that brings us to the end of our program here, some interesting different ways to mark the seasons. I'll take a few minutes to see if there are any questions that we can address before we wrap our program up. All right, looking through here, we're seeing some comments about someone is saying that even in New York City, Orion pops right out. So Orion is really handy for several reasons. Even in our dazzling city skies, we can see Orion really, really well. But here's another thing you may not realize. Orion is over the Earth's equator, which means you can see it just as well from the north and the south hemispheres. So I often go to South America. I'm a tango dancer, and go to Buenos Aires to follow my bliss in terms of dancing. And as you look up at 4 in the morning, if you're leading a dance in Argentina, the only thing that even this planetarium guy recognizes in the sky from South America is Orion the Hunter. And it can be a really handy dandy way to begin to get a handle on the southern skies. So Orion is like a friend in a strange place that you can see as you're traveling below the equator. I'm afraid that mouse is winning over lion over and over in terms of that Leo question. And then getting some questions about when we're open. So as a reminder, we are open at Liberty Science Center Thursdays through Sundays. Weekdays, we're generally open from 10 to 4, 10 to 5 on weekends. Every hour that we're open, we have a planetarium program. We also have a special Monday opening this coming Monday the 5th because of the fact that the schools are on spring break right now. Really good idea, though, to get advanced tickets. We do limit capacity both at LSC overall and at our planetarium, which maxes out at 90 right now. So we do programs in the dome, one on the planets, one on deep space. If you have young kids, our One World, One Sky show featuring Elmo and Big Bird is extremely popular. And then Krista has done a fantastic job on our new laser show, which features music about animals as a tie-in to our big festival. We also, during this Wild About Animals period, have a butterfly house. So I would highly recommend you come and check that out as well. Great to see so many of my colleagues, including my mom. Shout out to my mom there in Tampa. Pat Terun-Inverso, a colleague of mine from our Pacific Science Center days in Seattle. Great to see her here as well. This is like old home week here. This is your life, Mike Shanahan. And so I don't see any other questions at this point. So as we're hitting about 5:40, we're going to go ahead and wrap this program up shortly. So we do hope to see you all sometime at the Mothership at Liberty Science Center and the Jennifer Chalsty Planetarium. And if you enjoy the programs of Krista and Andrew and me, when you go to our dome, it's going to be one of the three of us always doing one of the shows. And we've had a few folks come by and say, hey, I recognize you from your Facebook Live show. So hopefully we'll be able to have you do a wave or whatever if you come to see us in our dome. Now our next program is on a special day, right? So we're going to be doing a show about the supermoon. So it's going to be on Monday, the 26th of April. So it's going to be 2 in 1 month because the actual supermoon, like the largest full moon of this year, is on the night of the 26th of April. So we wanted to do the show at 5 o'clock so you can then theoretically walk out and enjoy that big bright moon that night. And outside of that, we're going to return to our format of having shows on the first Thursday of each month. So the website here, if you go to lsc.org, libertysciencecenter.org, just lsc.org, and just find the part that says LSC in the house. And that tells you all of our upcoming presentations, but everything we've ever done, going back to last April, when Krista did our first planet show as a Facebook program, all those shows are there. So if you're interested in astrology, we got an astrology show. If you're interested in the planet Mars, we did a whole series of shows about Mars, both because it was so bright this last fall and because of all the missions going to Mars. If you're wondering why Pluto is not a planet, if you're wondering about black holes or galaxies, we got shows on all of those topics. Everyone, including this show, is going to be posted there. So this show should be up on our site within 24 hours or so. Checking one last time. Yes, Victoria is saying Happy April Fool's Day, although hopefully everything I said in the show was accurate and not an April Fool's prank. It is a very interesting thing, having been in Hawaii, where part of your job is to interpret the culture of the astronomy of another culture, to make sure that you can be as authentic as possible in trying to explain that, because obviously it's also easy to inject rumor, myth, or untrue ideas as well. So we do try to vet our information as much as possible. So that brings us to the end. Again, hope we'll see some of you at the Big Dome itself someday. And thank you for joining us, everybody, for Facebook Live Planetarium Online.